Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today, you've seen him here before, is Scott Ritter. He's a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and a former UN Special Commission weapons inspector. He's also an author. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
So, Scott, we are now entering into the Trump administration, and I think a lot of people have questions. More so, I think, about foreign policy. That's been a big one that's been on the radar. There was recent news that was announced today. Trump says that Putin's meeting is being set up to end the bloody mess of the Ukraine war. The Kremlin said Friday that it welcomed the president-elect's willingness to talk and that there would be likely progress on the subject after he is sworn in later this month. So, this is one of the big ones I think a lot of people have been waiting to see, because Trump said that if he was in office, this war with Ukraine would have never happened. I'm still a little skeptical about this, but they have already set up a meeting and the inauguration hasn't happened yet. Where do you think this goes from here? Do you think that we will see an end to the Ukraine war this year?
100%. It may take 6 months. It may take a little bit longer than that because there's a lot of complexities to untangle. Number one of which is, how long it takes Donald Trump to realize that Russia will not yield on any of the major points, that this isn't going to be a negotiation where Trump comes in and gets his way. But Trump has already, he made an important statement yesterday. He said that this war was created by NATO's expansion into Ukraine. Now, I said that 2 years ago, got banned from YouTube because it was the truth. But the YouTube, their fact checkers didn't quite like that. It's a narrative that Ukraine doesn't like. It's a narrative that the United States under the Biden administration doesn't like. NATO doesn't like it. The European Union doesn't like it because it's true. This is a war that we're responsible for. The narrative right now is that Russia invaded tiny, innocent, Democrat-loving Ukraine. No, Ukraine. The truth is Ukraine has been a tool by the United States, NATO, and Europe to destroy Russia. And it's been a tool that's been used for decades, not just what happened recently. So, Russia's response is the old fool around, find out kind of thing, meaning, if you want to play big boy games, you play big boy prices. And Ukraine started playing a big boy game, and Russia said, okay, we're now going to that level. And that's why we're at war. But it's not because Russia woke up one morning and went, I'm feeling my imperial muscles. Let's make a move on Ukraine. Russia didn't want this war. Russia did everything possible to stop this war. And Trump finally accurately, because, Sabby, I've said this many, many times, you can't solve a problem that you don't first accurately define. So to bring an end to the crisis in Ukraine, you say, well, you want to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, then what is the problem? Why did this war happen? Because if this is truly about the independence of poor, independent, democratic Ukraine, there's one ending that we can accept. But if this is about Ukraine being a tool to bring down Russia, then that creates a completely different solution. And Trump is now recognizing that the problem isn't Russia. The problem is NATO. The problem is Ukraine. And so that opens the door for a meaningful discussion. There's another element that Trump is going to have to address, and I'm sure that'll come up in the discussion. It's what's the strategic objective of the United States? Because right now, under Biden administration, it's the strategic defeat of Russia. And Russia is not going to entertain any negotiation that begins with the premise that America's policy continues to be the strategic defeat of Russia. So Trump will have to make another statement that is no longer our policy objective. And then I think we're everything's on board. Complicating factors are Ukraine and NATO, and they're going to have to be compelled to accept. And the way that Ukraine gets compelled is Ukraine must be defeated, and that defeat will happen when the United States shuts off the aid. NATO's unable to step up to the plate, and Ukraine collapses, and then that creates the conditions for Russia to impose its will through whatever treaty vehicle there will be. That, like I said, that could take up to 6 months. Ukraine is not going to go gently into that good night, and neither is NATO. We see them now meeting in Ramstein for what might be the last meeting of the Ramstein Coordination Group to send aid to Ukraine. Reports are saying that it's a very depressed environment, that everybody realizes that this is it, that it's over, that, whatever they thought they were going to accomplish is not going to be accomplished, because next week there's a new sheriff in town, and the sheriff ain't playing this game, shutting the game down. But I am optimistic that Trump is going to pull this one off, because it's essential that he does. Trump doesn't have a vested interest in Ukraine, because Trump is not married to the current modeling regarding NATO, to make NATO vital and again, to revive NATO, to make it the cornerstone. Trump accurately points to NATO and says, you're the reason why we're in this mess. Why are you expanding? And the moment you start to question NATO expansion, you start to dismantle the entire narrative that's been created in Europe about the importance and the relevance of NATO. And Trump is doing that right now. So that's the end of NATO. I personally believe that NATO won't survive Trump's first term. I think that Trump is out to kill NATO, and he will unplug from NATO, and NATO will collapse rapidly. But that's part of this peace treaty, because one of the things that Ukraine will have to be given is some sort of security guarantees, or assurances, as they're like to be called in this environment, because a guarantee means you're guaranteeing something. And we all know that the 1994 Bucharest memorandum was assurances, the one that Ukraine always says, we gave up our nuclear weapons. Well, they weren't their nuclear weapons. They surrendered them because they were obligated to do so. But they always say that the West guaranteed our security. Now, reread the agreement. The West gave assurances to your security, but the assurances always have caveats attached. And unfortunately for Ukraine, all of the caveats that were attached in 1994 were violated by both Ukraine, the European Union, and NATO, which led to the current situation. But there will have to be some sort of guarantees. But I think it's going to be Russian-dictated guarantees, meaning that Russia is going to say, don't worry, we got this one. And you know who's sympathetic to this? See, in the West, we gave short shrift when Russia said we have legitimate national security interests in the nations that surround us, especially the former Soviet republics, the near abroad, as they like to call it. And we, the United States and Europe, went, no, these are independent sovereign states. You have no right to impose your will. There's no such thing as national interests, and you don't automatically inherit this. You know who disagrees with that? Donald Trump. How do we know? Well, he's going to invade Greenland, and he's going to take over the Panama Canal. So we know that Donald Trump understands the concept of, national security interests when it comes to territories abutting the United States. And I think he's going to be sympathetic to the argument made by Russia in this regard, especially when it comes to Ukraine.
So then what happens to Ukraine? And this is, I think, the big question a lot of people have had. Once this is all over, what does happen to Ukraine? They already applied to try to join NATO, and they were rejected. Where do they? What happens to the borders, and what happens to people in the Donbass?
Well, the Donbass is Russian. They're already Russian. Lugansk and Donetsk are independent republics of the Russian Federation, along with Kherson and Zaporizhia, and that will not change. Russia will die before. So there will be no return of territories to Ukraine. Ukraine has permanently lost Crimea and the 4 territories of Novaya Russia, New Russia, including the Donbass, Lugansk, and Donetsk. Ukraine has to be careful not to lose more. And I'm concerned that Ukraine will lose more, that part of this peace deal. Understand this, Ukraine as it currently exists will not exist once this peace deal is done. Zelensky is finished. There will be a new government. The Russians will dictate this government. The government will require to be put in a new constitution that outlaws the political parties of Ukraine today. There will be a period of 3 to 5 years of occupation where Russia re-educates people and reforms people before elections are had to elect a new Ukrainian government that will be approved by the Russians. This is what losing a war looks like. There will not be a Ukraine the way you know it today. Zelensky will either be dead or in exile, and all of his politicians will either be captured in prison or, living in a think tank environment in the West, waxing philosophically about how the West betrayed them. But there will be no Ukraine, not the way we know it. And that's what people don't understand. All this talk of people about freezing the conflict, about, peacekeepers and all. When Russia wins this war, whether they win it at the negotiating table or on the battlefield or a combination of the two, there won't be a Ukraine as you currently recognize it. Russia won't accept it. And so that's the reality. And I think Trump is going to go along with this.
Wow. Well, you said the part I think a lot of people need to hear, because people are talking about this as though Ukraine is going to be able to move forward, or they're going to get some type of win, which I think you and I talked about this a long time ago, that like there was no way that Ukraine was going to be able to win anyway. And the U.S. government was trying to find a way to cripple Russia. You mentioned NATO, and that is something I want to discuss as well. There have been many talks. I mean, I attended a protest that said to, dismantle NATO. NATO's got to go. What happens to NATO if like after this, because this is something that has been in place for quite some time. And how do you think other countries in the West will feel about that?
Well, let's start with what happened to NATO. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, NATO lost its reason to exist. There was literally no reason for NATO to continue. But the United States used it as a vehicle to solidify American control, not only over Western Europe, but the newly independent Eastern Europe. We wanted to expand NATO to bring these nations under our wing to prevent Russia from using its past historical relationships to continue to impose its will on these nations as part of Russia's so-called near abroad. We wanted to weaken Russia, and we weakened Russia by taking away its former allies and such. That was what NATO expansion was about. NATO also became a tool of not just European power, but in Europe, NATO was supposed to be about protecting Europe, but it became a tool for expanding European power. And they did that two ways. One was to get involved in cleaning up the historical mistakes of Europe, the Balkans, Yugoslavia. NATO was heavily involved in the dismemberment of Yugoslavia and the imposition of European will over the Balkan nations. And we saw that manifest itself in 1999, where this defensive alliance, NATO, engaged in an offensive war of aggression against a European nation, Serbia. A lot of people have forgotten that. NATO bombed a European capital. NATO bombed a European capital. That tells you that NATO is fundamentally broken. Fundamentally broken. And then NATO went on in 2011 and carried out a war of aggression against Libya to overthrow a regime in Libya that's led to absolute disaster there. NATO helped facilitate 20 years of incompetence in Afghanistan. And that was the overextension of NATO. And it proved that NATO wasn't what NATO thought it was. See, NATO thought it was a partner of the United States, especially after 9/11 when NATO was pressured. Everybody says NATO stood up and invoked Article 5. No, the United States pressured NATO into invoking Article 5 because we needed the political, the looks, the optics of NATO coming to us. We were under attack. But what was NATO's Article 5 commitment? They brought in some AWACS airplanes to fly over American territory as if we needed, Luxembourg AWACS with a NATO symbol on it flying over America when we have, it's absurd. It was symbolic. And then they did something about protecting a naval task force to protect Europe from migration out of North Africa. Total jokes. Nothing. It's a nothing burger. But NATO used Article 4 to go into Afghanistan. That's not Article 5. That's Article 4. And they went into Afghanistan and participated in regime change operations there that have nothing to do with transatlantic security and everything to do with, serving American interests. And then we got them involved in nation building and things of that nature. Why is a North Atlantic defensive organization involved in nation building exercises in Afghanistan, in a part of the world they don't even understand? And in the end, they were betrayed by the United States. And that was the signal to NATO that you simply don't matter. You're nothing. You look how we abandoned it. And this wasn't Trump that abandoned it. This was Biden. And remember, Biden is Mr. The NATO relationship is a sacred trust. Article 5 is a sacred duty. And yet when it came to Afghanistan, 1 minute we were passing around the 10 cup saying, hey, you guys got to fund this thing, keep it up, keep your mission going. And in the same year, just a few months later, we left NATO and went, oh, sorry, yeah, we're out of here. You're on your own. And NATO's like, what? We just raised money. We put a lot of political capital into extending this mission, and now you've run, and now we have to leave, and it looks horrible. And so NATO in August of 2021 was a entity that was demoralized and in danger of collapsing. And then Ukraine. We use Ukraine to unify NATO, to re-justify NATO's existence. And now NATO becomes this aggressive force working with the Ukrainians to help bring down Russia. This defeat, and NATO has been defeated, by the way, it didn't work, is the end of NATO. NATO can't survive this. It will begin the internal collapse of NATO, but what will accelerate that is Donald Trump, for instance, telling NATO in the after, first of all, that they have to leave Ukraine, that there is no future of NATO in Ukraine. That's a huge blow to NATO, who has said, all Stoltenberg and now Ritter, NATO has, the inherent right of expansion, that Russia doesn't get to dictate who gets to join NATO or not. Well, Russia just dictated it at the point of a gun, and you lost, you backed down. So that's a problem. But then the other problem comes when Trump says, and America is going to be withdrawing a lot of its support. We need you to step up and fund this. You need to go up to 5%. What NATO countries can do that? Germany can't, France can't, England can't. They can't afford that. And when they can't afford it, then you're going to get political discussions internal to these nations about, is this what we want to do? And that's the death of the European Union. When Germany starts saying what's good for Germany, when France starts saying what's good for France, that's the end of the European Union. So this is killing two birds with one stone. Trump is going to take down NATO and take down the European Union, both of which he blames for getting us involved in this ridiculous exercise in Ukraine. And he's going to succeed. Both of these institutions, there's an election, I think, in February 12th or so in Germany. Alternative for Deutschland, political party, might win. And if they win, they have said, we are withdrawing from the European Union.
Wow.
They withdraw from that's it. If the thing that makes the European Union viable is German central banking. And if you take Germany out of that, that's the end of the Europe. That's the end of the euro. And you're going to see nations going back to their own currencies. And that's it. NATO, you're already seeing. Let me just show you how ridiculous NATO is right now. Trump made some statements about Greenland. And he said, I'm not excluding the use of military force to go into Greenland. Greenland belongs to Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally. Trump is talking actively about invading and occupying the soil of a NATO ally. We now have the French foreign minister telling Trump that will mean war between Europe and America. How healthy is NATO again? Remind me of how healthy NATO is right now when the United States is talking about invading and occupying a NATO state, and NATO members are talking about the potential of a war with Europe against the United States. Now, they'll never go to war against us because they can't. But my point is, there is no unity. Trump is going to destroy NATO and the European Union because they deserve to be destroyed. They stand for nothing. They both have failed. Name one good thing NATO has done since the Cold War ended. You can't. Name one thing Europe has done since the Cold War. Europe is responsible for the destruction of Europe. The European Union is responsible for the destruction of Europe. Their policies on open borders, the immigration issue, wherever you stand on immigration, I mean, I'm personally, sympathetic to people who are being thrown out of their homeland because of, crime and economic interests and all that. But Europe let them in with no plan. And what's happening is you get this xenophobic response where nations are starting to say, Europe is responsible for destroying our national identity. And the Germans are going hard right on this one, saying, no more immigrants. We're done with European policy. France is a disaster because of unrestrained immigration. They've lost control of Marseille and other. There's parts of Paris that are out of the control of the French government because of bad immigration policies. The United Kingdom is feeling it. Other European countries are all feeling this. And what's going to happen is they're going to start looking more out for themselves than this concept of European unity. And that's the end of the European Union. The European Union was a disaster for European states because under the European Union, you stop thinking about being a German and you start thinking about being a European. But what does being a European mean? It's a meaningless term. Europe is a continent. It's not a culture. The culture is Italian. The culture is German. The culture is French. The culture is Danish. That's the culture. And what the European Union was saying is that doesn't matter anymore. We're now this unified entity with free borders, free labor. A Pole can travel across and work and live anywhere they want to. Borders no longer matter. But European nations are now waking up saying borders do matter. Poland has been very clear that there will not be an immigrant problem in Poland because they're not going to let immigrants in. That's a complete violation of European Union policy.
Wow.
This is how the European Union is going to collapse. It has no chance of surviving.
So then that brings me to this point, because I did notice there were hints about this coming from President Macron, who's also on his way out. But he made a statement last year that he wants to know why France always has to follow the United States. He said, why do we have to follow them? Why can't we make decisions based on what's best for us? But he was talking about Europe collectively. He was saying, like, why do we have to follow the lead of the United States? And I was like, people are starting to ask that question, right? So there's that. And then when you talk about the EU, what would that mean for foreign policy decisions? Because I've spoken to people like Claire Daly, who was a part of the EU, and was very vocal to stand up on the floor in the EU to push back against all of these wars. What does that mean now? Because I remember when they agreed to allow the Leopard tanks go into Ukraine. Mm-hmm. How does that work? Like, if the European Union collapses, what does that mean for foreign policy matters when it comes to a vote?
Well, we go back to pre-European Union Europe, where Germany was Germany, France was France. Now they had NATO that provided collective security, but German foreign policy was independent, not subordinated to whatever this European thing is. You go back to that, and and this is why it's attractive to Trump. I spent a lot of time studying leaders like Putin. Putin has been a project of mine since he came into power, and I study his words. I study his history, his background, just to try and understand what he's thinking in the direction he's trying to take Russia. It's important to have that level of comprehension. Trump. People tend to be dismissive of Trump. They judge him based upon superficialities. And in many ways, he's a character that lends himself to that. We don't need to get into the textual detail, but we are aware of the NBC tape where he was on a bus talking with somebody and he made some comments about how he treats women, very crude comments. And, that tends to dominate our thinking process about Trump, a very crude, simple individual. But if you want to know Trump, watch The Apprentice. Watch The Apprentice. What did Trump do in The Apprentice? Because this is Trump's show. He's the one that, organized it and directed. People are working for an objective that everybody seems to want. In this case, it was, $250,000 salary job promoting one of Trump's properties. And they're competing. But what Trump did is he organized them into teams and they'd compete against each other. Do you understand the genius of that move? How do you control people? How do you dominate people? And how do you learn about people other than putting them into teams and then putting them against each other? And then he's sitting there watching this.
He got that from business school. That's a business school thing.
and then he takes the losing team and he sits down and he dissects why they lost. He compels them to think about the dynamic, and he's learning from that too. This is a learning process for Trump. He's not just educating them, but he's learning about them. And then he fires one of them. And then he goes back and he makes two new teams and he starts the process all over again. This is how Donald Trump thinks. So now Trump wants to deal with Europe. It's very difficult for Trump to deal with individual European nations. And he learned this when he was president the first time. because you have NATO and the European Union always getting in the way. Whatever he wanted to do, nation to nation, got complicated by NATO and by the European Union. Trump's perfect Europe isn't a singularity, but a team of nations competing against one another. And Trump will play apprentice with Europe. And that's what he wants to do. He wants to get Italy to compete against Germany and then look at the two and then fire one of them and pick the other one. That's how he's going to control Europe. Europe will become a more complete vassal of the United States. Macron was correct in many ways. He recognized that Europe, as it's currently configured, had totally subordinated itself to the United States. But that included NATO and the European Union. Macron was talking about the European Union redefining itself as an independent entity, European entity free of American domination. But you can't. The European Union always grew married to the NATO concept. You can't separate the European Union from NATO, and NATO is 100% American controlled. That's why Macron spoke about the need to create a European defense agency, common defense. But you can't have that and NATO. You can't afford to have two defense entities like that. So it was always unrealistic. Macron rightfully understood the problem, but never had a solution to that problem. Because he was always married to this notion of a European Union that fundamentally is unsustainable. And Trump knows this. And I think Trump is now going to come in and, we'll see. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. He's not even president yet. But I believe that one of his big objectives is not only the dismantlement of NATO, but the dismantlement of the European Union so that he can play apprentice with Europe. And maybe he'll do a new TV show called, Apprentice Europe. We'll see.
No, this is all really interesting. I did talk about his remarks about Greenland. To me, it's just I don't think that's going to happen. I did hear from a representative from Greenland. She was on the news recently, and she said the majority of people in Greenland do not want this to happen. There's also this piece that a lot of people are leaving out. China does have investments in Greenland, and I feel like that's the real reason why he wants to consume Greenland. And nobody's asking the question about what happens to the benefits of the people that live in Greenland. So, for example, they have universal healthcare in Greenland. From what I understand, I think Denmark pays for that. So my question is, again, nobody's asking these questions. If we were to acquire Greenland, what does that mean for the benefits of the people in Greenland? Is the U.S. or taxpayers, are we going to have to pay the healthcare for people in Greenland? So again, I don't think that's going to happen, but people need to start asking those questions and ask, what is this really about? And what matters the most, which is that it seems like regardless of the political party, both parties really want to go after China, and they want to, I think, suppress China's economic gains. And same thing with the Panama Canal. What did they say? He said, why is the Panama Canal, doing business with China? But Panama can decide to do what it wants. And that's another thing. So when I hear him make these statements that he doesn't rule out military force, but he hopes it doesn't come to that with Panama, I'm like, what is happening? What?
Let me push back just a little bit. I mean, I support your heart on this one, because it's horrible to think of the United States invading and occupying Greenland or Panama Canal. I think he's going to do it. I think it's going to happen very soon.
You really think so?
100%. First of all, with Panama, we have a neutrality treaty, and it's just dependent upon how the United States interprets Panama's violation of neutrality. Trump is making the case, I disagree with the case, that China's control of the ports, but they have Hong Kong-based management companies in there. His concern is that with China in control of port operations, if the Chinese Communist Party ever gave the order that these Chinese companies could shut down the Panama Canal, and that's 70% of American container traffic goes through the Panama Canal. 40% of all of our shipping goes through the Panama Canal, and Trump is making the case that we can't give China that option. And so to prevent China from ever being able to do this hypothetical, which is improbable to begin with, Trump he will order the U.S. military to invade and occupy the Panama Canal, citing violation of the neutrality treaty. And because the United States is not held accountable to any standard of international law, we'll get away with it. And Panama won't resist, because Panama knows what happened in 1989 when Just Cause came in and what we did to Panama to get rid of Noriega. And I just think we're in that world right now. And on Greenland, there's 44,000 people in Greenland. I think if we got into a bidding war with Denmark, we will win that bidding war, and we will get the Greenland population to say that they want independence, that there will be a referendum, and that the United States will take over control of the security of Greenland until which time that referendum is held. And there's nothing Denmark can do about it. And Trump knows this. We already occupy Greenland. We have American troops on the ground in Greenland. And if the Danish government makes any effort to interfere with that, we will cite national security interests and we will send more troops in there. I think Trump is totally committed to this, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. Nothing. That's the sad thing. Denmark has an army of 17,000. What are they going to do? Is France really going to go to war against the United States to prevent America from occupying territory it already occupies? And 44,000, I think the United States could come up with an agreement that that provides for all the services over a period of time that the citizens of Denmark have. I'm just saying that I think Trump is dead serious on this one, and here's the reason why. It's not about China has two concessions, mining concessions, but they're not being developed. China wanted to do something with them. They've had some problems waning. The problem is the geography of Greenland and global the climate change, which is thawing the Arctic ice cap and making transportation along the Northwest Passage suddenly viable and opening up territories for mineral exploitation. There's a lot of wealth up there. Russia has the advantage right now in terms of how it's projected its influence in the region. Russia put a flag on the North Pole saying that it belongs to us. We challenge that, but Russia's asserting itself already, and Russia is also the dominant power in the area because of its icebreaker fleet. I mean, no nation has icebreakers like Russia, so the only nation right now that can make Northwest Passage viable consistently is Russia. China wants to assert it's talking about creating the Arctic Silk Road. It wants to come up and use these sea lanes as part of their their supply chain dominance. And that's why Trump, when he talks about Greenland, he's talking about shipping. We got Chinese shipping. He doesn't want that. And the best way for him to control that is to make Greenland the United States, now projecting American territorial interests into these very waters where the United States can now control shipping and control a lot of the economic development taking place. That's what he wants. He views China moving into the Arctic as an existential threat to the United States. I'm not agreeing with all of his analysis. I'm saying that's how he's thinking, and therefore it's a 100% certainty that he's going to take over Greenland. That's a 100% certainty.
But that's just more intervention, and that's more intervention.
Well, he's trying to create Fortress America. That's what he's trying to do. Wait till you see what he do. One thing we're not talking about is Peru, because the Chinese aren't stupid. They're actually some of the savviest people out there when it comes to global economy. They recognize their own vulnerability in the Panama Canal. I mean, Trump is paranoid about China shutting down the Panama Canal, but the Chinese are very aware of the fact the United States can shut down the Panama Canal anytime it wants to. And now, China, who is dependent upon the flow of shipping and stuff, sees disruptions. So the Chinese have gone in and built a port facility in Peru, a multi-billion-dollar port facility that's actually just opened up. I think they just last month, the Chinese president was there. So was Biden for a different thing, but they opened up the port. And the Chinese are now in there building rail line connectivity from this port into Brazil, into Ecuador, into the neighboring countries, so that they can achieve the goal, because Brazil is an Atlantic country. Brazil doesn't have Pacific interface, but China is going to land in Peru and then move into Brazil and bypass the need to go through the Panama Canal and then the Caribbean, which is an American controlled lake, to work their way down the coast. They're just going to land in Peru and shoot their stuff over by rail. That's a threat. I can guarantee you by the time the Trump administration has consolidated itself in Greenland and in Panama, that Trump is going to say that port can't be Chinese controlled. And he's going to tell the Peruvians that they have to turn control of the port over to the United States, and that's part of America. He's trying to create Fortress America. He's trying to create this blob of land that is American dominated, and the Chinese won't be allowed in there. And that's from Greenland, and I believe it's going to go down to Peru. You know, Argentina is already on board. Watch what happens this year. Interesting year coming up. BRICS is chaired by Brazil. And of course, BRICS is the ultimate geopolitical challenge to the United States, the rules-based international order, et cetera. Watch the pressure that's put on the Brazilian leadership, the Brazilian government by the United States to curtail BRICS. I mean, already under the Brazilian leadership, Indonesia has become a full partner. Do you understand what that means? One of the most populous lands in the world, one of the most strategic lands in the world, in the Pacific, whose neutrality we always assumed would be there. That's why they're such a big player in the G20, in the ASEAN group. Indonesia's joined BRICS. Malaysia and Thailand are applying to become BRICS members. The Philippines, thinking that they're part of this ASEAN community that the United States is capping and everybody supporting one another, is watching these major powers flee. Watch what the Philippines do in the next couple of years. I bet you they put in an application to BRICS too. This is crippling to the United States, crippling to the United States. And so, you know, we can't just give from Trump's world. You can't just give the Pacific to China without protecting your own interests. If you give the Pacific to China and you give them this port in Peru and they're able to project into South America, they're defeating the United States. And so Trump, I believe, is going to secure Greenland, secure the Panama Canal, make a move on Peru, work to overthrow the sentiment in Brazil, maybe even to get Brazil out of BRICS, and solidify relations with Argentina and make South America part of Fortress America. That's I think his strategic thinking right now. He views China as the number one threat to the United States. China, as we speak, the Chinese foreign minister is doing his annual tour in Africa. China is taking over Africa economically. So Trump's looking at the world map. Pacific is going to China. Africa is going to China. Europe's in total chaos. Russia's aligning with China. And if you sit back and go business as usual, Greenland now becomes a base for China to project into the Arctic Sea, and Peru becomes a base for China to expand into Brazil and all that. And that just leaves America surrounded. And that's something Trump doesn't want. So when Trump says that Greenland is essential to the national security of the United States, he believes it. And that's why I take him at his word when he says it's going to be an American territory.
Wow. This is crazy. I want to.
It's crazy, isn't it? I'm going to get. I just want to say this because what's going to happen, Sabby, it always happens. People listen to this and they think that I want this to happen because I'm doing an assessment. They go, "Oh, Ritter's defending Trump." I'm not. I'm against all of this. This runs counter to everything I believe in: international law, dialogue, debate. This is a very confrontational policy, and I'm finishing up an article right now, I believe dooms us to fail, because I do believe we will be successful in creating Fortress America. But then the problem is that Fortress America has to be able to viably integrate into a world. By creating a Fortress America, you create a trap. You trap yourself. And I think that's what Trump is doing. He doesn't believe it. He thinks he's building a foundation upon which we can project, but he's trapping himself into a world now where every other interest is going to be the rest of the world. And we're not going to be able to hold on to South America, because the history of empires always show that the conquered people, the occupied people, rise up, and we're going to watch all the reversals, and it's going to be a disaster for America. So I guess the sparkle in my eyes, I'm talking about it, is just because it's fascinating from just an observer standpoint, but I don't support what Trump's doing. I think it's disastrous for the world. I think it's disastrous for America. But you made a comment where you said you don't believe that he's going to take Greenland. I don't support him taking Greenland, but I believe he's going to do it. I believe 100% that he's going to do it, because it melds into his vision of this fortress. Make America great again means expanding American empire to control, sort of like a new Monroe Doctrine, to control the areas around us.
Wow. Well, crazier things domestically as well. because I'm sure we all heard about this, but these two stories in particular that I covered, it was very alarming to me. The New Orleans attacker discussed plans to kill family and join ISIS, and chilling recordings. Of course, this is coming from CNN. That's the suspect of the New Orleans attack there. And then within 24 hours, there was this Cybertruck explosion in Las Vegas, and they claimed that the suspect was Matthew Livelsberger, although the Las Vegas police earlier on said they couldn't confirm that the body that was found in that truck was him. I think later on they have made that confirmation. These two particular stories right at the start of the new year, to me, it just seemed a little too convenient. And I want to hear your take on this, because when I first heard about the New Orleans attack, the first thing I'm hearing from the news is that he had an ISIS flag, and the woman from the New York Post just walks through his home with no police, walks through a crime scene, no gloves on her hand or anything, and just points to, oh, look, and there's the Quran, which is left open, which has been explained to me by Muslim friends that you never leave the Quran open if you're not, praying. So there's that. And then again, within 24 hours, the Cybertruck explosion outside of the Trump Tower and this so-called manifesto that he has supposedly left behind. What's happening here? Both of these guys were former military. Does the military have anything to do with this? Do you think that maybe there could be some trauma here or some psychological effect after their time in the military? Do you feel that a greater source may be behind all this? A lot of people are pointing fingers at Israel. It seems a little too convenient to me, but what's your take?
Yeah, I to be honest, I don't know enough to straight out say Israel's not behind this, but my gut says Israel's not behind this. I'm the believer in Occam's razor. The most logical explanation is probably the explanation. The more you have to get into conspiracy to explain something, the more difficult I have, buying into it. The easiest one for me to get into is this special forces soldier. He comes from a community, and here I'm going to get in a lot of trouble, but that's okay. What the hell? I get in trouble all the time. The selection process to be a special forces soldier is a very substantive one, a very elite one. He's clearly physically fit, but they also run you through various psychological tests to find out, your ability to withstand stress and to survive under stress. The missions he was assigned to operate. He was a very highly trained special operator with very special skill sets, and but here's the problem. Just like the Navy SEALs have corrupted themselves by creating a culture that attracts psychopaths, straight up psychopaths. You just have to take a look at the SEAL. If you remember I think a book was written about him called Alpha. Eddie, I can't remember his last name right now. But he was a murderer, a psychopath. And the SEALs allowed this to happen and fostered it, continued to promote him, and allowed him to deploy where he murdered people. He's a murderer. But that's the sickness of the Navy SEALs, is that they've created a culture that allows this kind of sickness to thrive. And I think the special forces community has brought in a culture of conspiracy theorists, people who are very intelligent, but they are also very politically constrained, very conservative, and if not managed properly, could allow their brains to get thrown into things. Look at what this guy wrote about. Now, originally, when his manifesto came out, or this email came out, some people tried to say it's not real, but the FBI's come out and said, no, he wrote it. He wrote this. So that tells you everything, because this is not written by a professional special forces guy. This is written by a guy who's lost his mind, a guy who has become so paranoid that he's just seeing things and imagining things and all this stuff, because not too much of that is reality based. He didn't have access to the programs that he's talking about here. He's talking about, alien spacecraft and UFOs and all this stuff. He didn't have access to any of that. Some of that didn't even exist. It's a part of his mind. When you subject people, when you create this tool, because a special forces operator is a tool, you create this tool, you have to be careful because you can break this tool. You can send it, you can use it so much that it breaks, and you can subject it to so much pressure. The pressures that this operator and his fellow operators are under is something that most Americans can't comprehend. I think he broke. I think the guy went insane. And in the end, he believed in what he was what he was imagining was real, and he tragically took his life in an act outside of Trump Tower. That's what I think happened. I don't see any big conspiracy. You know, the connectivity between the military is Fort Bragg is home to a lot of elite units, a lot of secrecy, a lot of conspiracy taking place. So he lives a conspiratorial life. I mean, heck, one of his jobs, he's trained to be what they call Jedburgh. That's a guy who parachutes behind enemy lines and works with indigenous peoples to create, resistance groups, guerrilla warfare. He lives a fantasy novel life. And I'm sure he has been called upon to do programs that are special access programs that are highly classified, but he'll only get it on a need to know basis. He'll only get get a glimpse, but he won't understand the whole thing. And I think his mind he just snapped under the pressure of what was going on. I think he felt betrayal in Ukraine. He was involved in the training of Ukrainian special forces people. I just think he broke. That's my take on it. And that's a very shallow take because I don't claim to have in-depth knowledge of all this. But when I look at who he was, the training he had, and what he became, and this manifesto, which has been seen as written by him, he went off the rails. That manifesto could not have been written by a fully functional special forces operator. That manifesto was written by a mentally ill man. That's how I take it. Now, the New Orleans attacker, here's the tough part. ISIS has said that people can claim to be ISIS simply by making that declaration. And so if this was an ISIS attack, do you remember there was a shooting in San Bernardino, California, where a husband and wife team went to a party and shot it up and, ended up getting killed in a shootout and all that? Well, they, I believe, made a video where they declared that because that's the key thing is you have to declare that you take the creed and you make the statement and you become ISIS. And then ISIS says, oh yeah, that's one of us. You don't fly the ISIS flag upside down, which he did in his truck. I mean, and where's the video? I mean, if he had all this preparation, Quran open and all this stuff, where's the video where he's taking I forget the now, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. I think I know what the term is, but there's, when you take the creed, and there's only, one God, his name is Allah, that, and you basically now, ISIS hasn't even taken claim for this. ISIS isn't saying, yeah, this is one of ours. There's just a speculation. So what happened here? Why did this guy do this? Yes, he was in Fort Bragg. He was a Muslim, but I don't see the same deployment scheme or job-related scheme that would put the pressures on him. He seemed to make the transition to civilian life quite well. You saw the video where he's out there doing the promotion for his business and all that. It looks like a rational player. So there's something here that doesn't make any sense. I don't know how to wrap up this New Orleans thing. I have trouble trying to, put it into its proper box because there's so much about this doesn't make sense. Why did the Fox News reporter get access to why wasn't she arrested? She contaminated a crime scene. What was the purpose of that? Why was she allowed to go in there and create narratives that cannot go to trial?
And that's why I say, and that's why I kind of pointed fingers at Israel. I was like, gee, I wonder if Mossad is behind this because
this one could be, because this one I can't answer. The tragic death of the special forces operator, I think that's just a case of look, there's stuff that happens in Fort Bragg that Fort Bragg doesn't want us to talk about. Delta Force operatives, some of the most highly trained men in the world who are trained to, operate covertly and do, extreme things, come back and they're bored. You know what they do when they get bored? They rob banks because they're bored. And there was Delta Force operators that go out and rob banks. You know what else they do when they get bored? They murder their wives. They beat them to death. They abuse their spouses. They don't want you to talk about this. These are fundamentally broken people because of what we've done to them. We've sent them abroad. We've trained them. We break them. We come back, and we don't fix them. And they break. Fort Bragg is a cesspool of human tragedy that comes from these secret communities. People who are taken to the breaking point. They break. We don't fix them. We pretend to fix them. We bring them back. We plug them back in. And then bad things happen. And Fort Bragg is full of bad things happening. And I think this is one of those bad things that happened because of the culture of Fort Bragg, or as they call, I think today it's called Fort Liberty. I don't know what the new name is, but I can't make the same assessment of this New Orleans person. It's too weird what happened here. The FBI, why didn't they call it a terrorist act early on? What kind of politics game is being played there? See, there's a lot of politics involved in this. So there's something else going on in New Orleans than meets the eye. That's where I can leave it. I don't know enough, but the fact that this lady was able to gain access to this house and isn't under arrest and being charged says everything, because it says that nothing you saw in there was real. That was literally a Potemkin village put up there to create public perception. This is all about shaping public perception, which means it's propaganda. And since when do we do something in propaganda that kills? Is it 13 or 15? I don't know how many the final death count out of New Orleans is, but this is human tragedy. This man murdered, more than a dozen people, injured others. This isn't some propaganda game where you're just manipulating information. People died. And I want to know why they died, why he went behind the car. I mean, why he got the wheel of a car and drove it where he did. Why did he get out and engage? Because it's suicide by cop. He decided to go out suicide by cop. He started to engage police officers in a firefight that he wasn't going to win. Why did he do this? What is the reason? And the answers may have rested in his apartment, but not anymore, because you can't trust anything that you saw in that video. It's not usable in a court of law.
Wow. This is all crazy. Scott, you have an event. I do want to make sure we get to discuss this. You have an event that's coming up. It says Scott Ritter and Anya K.
Yeah.
Yeah, Scott Ritter covering Ukraine. Scott Ritter interviews through the eyes of Anya K. And it looks like it says dinner, discussion, and book signing. I want to talk a little bit about this.
Okay, well, Covering Ukraine is a book that I published last year, and Anya K is the name of the co-author. She's a podcaster from Poland who does a wonderful podcast called Through the Eyes of Anya K. And when the Ukraine conflict started, she reached out and we began to do interviews on a regular basis. And I was approached by my publisher to do a book about Ukraine. And I was struggling about the best way to do that on a timely fashion. I was concerned about, writing something from scratch only to have the situation change. And I was right. I mean, the situation changed dramatically, and you don't want to commit a book that then no longer has relevance. But then I looked at the interviews that she and I did, and I said, there's a book here. If we go into these interviews and we take key passages from the interviews and transcribe them and put them together, we create a compelling narrative that takes the reader from how this war started, why it started, and then how it developed and where we are today on the eve of Trump becoming president. It's a slim volume, 120 pages, but you can read it that quick, but you'll have to reread it because it's just chock full of information. So it's a good book. And Anya K, of course, isn't in the United States. So I've gone out and done a couple book events about this, but that's from my perspective. We're going to bring her to the United States. She arrives on Tuesday, and we're going to do these 3 events. We're going to go to the Bronx on the 15th. You can go to scottritter.com and get that information. It's a ticketed event. What I mean by that is when you come, you're going to get a dinner. It's an Italian restaurant. You get a dinner, you get the book as part of the price of the ticket. And then there's a little bit of overhead because we got to somehow pay for the airline and the hotels and all this stuff. But look, you're going to get a chance to see collaborators and talk about the process of collaborating on this project, what went into it. It's going to be a fascinating opportunity to get an insight not only into the subject of Ukraine, but the processes of collaboration on a topic of this sensitivity and complexity. Then on the 19th, we'll be in Washington, D.C. at Busboys and Poets, which is a well-known venue. We'll be at their 14th and V flagship location. We'll be doing a similar event. And then on the 21st, we go to Poughkeepsie, New York, home of Farmers and Chefs. That's a wonderful restaurant. I'd done a book event there in the past. Again, it's a ticketed event. You're going to get one of the best meals possible. The owner and chef, John Lasik, is a fantastic man. He's put together a menu. You'll see the menu if you go to the website. Again, you'll get a great dinner in a great venue. You'll get the book as price a ticket, and you'll get to, again, watch Anya and I discuss this and ask questions of us both. That's a key element of all three things. But it's a short book tour, but it's an opportunity to bring Anya K to the United States and introduce her to an American audience. So if people are interested in Ukraine and interested in supporting my work and the work of Anya K, please come to one of these events if you're able to.
That's so awesome. That's cool. So January 15th, the Bronx, January 19th, DC, and January 21st, Poughkeepsie, New York. And you can go to scottritter.com for more information about that. That's pretty awesome, Scott, that you guys were able to get her here. Oftentimes, both authors aren't present.
Well, we've done fundraising over the years to do projects. And we've done a lot of projects this year. We did a big one in November at the National Press Club. We did another project in New York City. I worked with Gerald Salante in September. So we've done it, and we raised money to do that. At the end of the year, any money we don't spend becomes taxable. If you don't spend it, then it becomes income, and you pay taxes. And we didn't raise that money to make it income. We raised that money to have to do things. And so we said, why don't we bring Anya K to the United States? We have the means to do that. And we're going to lose money on this. There's no doubt about it. This is not a money-making venture. This is about our mission of helping foster the acquisition of knowledge and information by a broader audience. And it's absolutely a unique opportunity to get both authors together in one place. And so we had the means to do it, and she had the availability. And so we made it happen. And we've just been blessed by a confluence of opportunity and means. And we're going to make it happen. And we will continue to do projects throughout the year to raise money and do valuable projects such as this.
Awesome. Scott Ritter, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.